Awesome. Alrighty, happy holidays everyone. Welcome to our weekly classic Hearthstone deck spotlight. We're joined tonight with a very special guest. He's a streamer, he's an author. He's also written Hearthstone guides for Ace Game Guides, and most recently broke into Legend in every mode on every server. So welcome, LaboreSangre. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we get started, I had a couple of questions. Maybe we can get to know you a little bit better. So, to start off with, how long have you played Hearthstone exactly?
I know it was before the LOE. I think it was either right after Curse of Noxaron, like just right as it was dropping, but pretty much for a long time. Some of the decks that were around in Classic, but like slightly more updated version. I think it was during Curse of Noxaron.
Yeah. So, what was your first deck when you were a noob? What was the thing that always got you going and got you interested?
Pretty sure my friends first recommended me. I remember two lists that they first recommended. One was a Druid list, and it ran the Force of Nature. But I remember a card that I don't remember the name of. It it you can either choose it to be a 2/1 with stealth or it's like a stealth or a 2/1 with charge or something like that, and that's why the reason I remember that it was like during not because it's slightly altered. But I think I started with Face Hunter and then I tried that Druid deck. First two decks that I remember.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I didn't get in on the Face Hunter craze during that time, but I really that's one of my biggest regrets in Hearthstone is that I never got to play with like Haunted Creeper, Knife Juggler back in Naxxramas. I think that was a very strong deck back then.
Yeah, for me in my first couple years of Hearthstone, like mid-range Hunter was one of my favorite. Decide Unleash the Hounds, Houndmaster, Animal Companion, Bow, just lots of trades and summoning creatures, and it's really good for like learning the game.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, maybe kind of as a corollary to that, what got you into interested in the classic format to begin with?
So I think overall I've like separate months, not in account of Legends or anything. I think I've been Legend and Classic like 3 months. I it's after it came out. I think I waited maybe a couple months or didn't quite get. I remember playing to Legend with Control Paladin one of the months, and then like maybe trying it again. But in general, I think it was just populated by like Renathal or just things going in a certain direction that I may or may not have wanted to play at the time weren't necessarily viable, or I got tilted or tired of a certain format. I would just jump around and try other stuff. And for me, like Control, something that I thought was kind of off meta or would be fun trying, and just wanted to give a try. I was of course hindered, the stereotype people are like, oh, it's boring or you don't really get into it, saying like there's not as much power creep in modern day. But it was a pretty nice change of pace for me.
Yeah, it's a little bit slower than standard, a lot
Fresh.
fewer
It
board
was it was
wipe.
fresh too.
Yeah,
Even if it's like old cards, it was different, different experience.
yeah, absolutely. And some of those old cards aren't even playable in standard, like Keeper of the Grove, things like that, that have been nerfed into the ground. So it's kind of fun to play those cards as they were at the time. Now, you've played a lot of different formats. You played a lot of standard. You played a lot of wild. What do you feel is really the characteristic that you would describe about classic that makes it different from those other formats?
For classic, it's a lot more board oriented. Like Control, for example, doesn't have like absolutely bonkers. Or if it does, it's like too expensive and not necessarily viable. Like Twisting Nether and Warlock archetypes, they use that because you have to fight for board first. So all the Control good, like Warrior, for example, they really just hard fight for board with a lot of play big minions. So it's kind of like controlling the board until you play out your, but you can't just rely on like very heavy spells to do it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there tends to be a pretty significant difference in how you build your board and how you extend an advantage in Classic as compared to something like Wild or Standard. Now
And
you're,
almost
yeah,
like we talked about with Renethal, like cards, yellow cards, like or just random effects where you just insta lose to something around a set pile of cards that you tend to know. I mean, general idea of exactly what you're going to be up against, like exactly in for it's like perfectionism in a format, you could say, in regards to like how you play. You can very easily strive for perfection more, you know.
yeah, absolutely. I like that point a lot. There are always a lot of interesting deck building decisions that we make in Classic because we're limited by the power level of the cards, and we are also limited because cards don't get nerfed, cards don't get changed, and we don't have the introduction of new cards. So there's a lot of wiggle room in Classic to kind of move around, flex different things. There are surprisingly still unexplored archetypes or underplayed or underrepresented archetypes as well.
Like trap.
Yeah, exactly. Decks that just kind of come out of the blue that they make a lot of sense, but at the same time, they just never existed in this format, but way back when in 2014, 2015.
I think another way to put it, instead of like the whole perfectionism, like the influence of decision making, or like really learning lines you have to go towards, or how much of a mulligan you can keep, or just trades you have to make, like Hearthstone fundamentals, and just really helps your decision making, like playing Classic. It's important decision making there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you're a master of really every format, and I'm curious, after having played so much Hearthstone in so many formats, what is it that keeps you interested in playing this game and playing Hearthstone just in general?
So for me, that's a really good question. I mean, for me, Hearthstone's always been my bread and butter. Like, it was the first card game that I ever played. It took me a while from playing Hearthstone to try other things. Notably, if we're sticking in the card game realm, like Runeterra, recently Marvel Snap, MTG, other stuff like that. I have a lot of experience in. But I've always been I've grown into the idea of having like side games where Hearthstone will be my main game. Sometimes I'll have like Hearthstone running and then other like side. For me, it's just always been my main game. But whenever it comes down to like buying all these different modes and stuff, uh, that's a really for me, like the Death Knight was what made getting the full Night Legends possible. Like people at the time that I was doing it were really sleeping on Fry because they were just kind of worlds, pre-standard worlds. Death Knight wasn't brought at all for the worlds, and people just saying like, "Oh, you have to go Blood, DK." And for me, I really enjoyed messing around with it, and I since my accounts were free, I could just use Death Knight and not have to craft too much and slowly get dust to craft decks or that kind of thing. For me, I don't know. It was just enjoyable to me. Just the classic legends and stuff. It was just all enjoyable playing and just trying different modes.
That's awesome. Yeah, and for those of those viewers that don't know, nine X Legend in one season with almost 2 weeks left to spare. That means Legend on every server in every game mode. Perhaps a world's first. I don't know anybody else that's piped up and said, "Hey, I did that too," and provided proof of it. So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
heard any other proof or any of that. So
yeah.
maybe the world's first. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's a very special achievement no matter what. It takes a lot of dedication. It just takes a lot of skill, right? Some players will spend all month trying to get Legend, but getting Legend so quickly in every format, on every server, with lots of different playstyles, very, very impressive. Speaking of Legend and Classic, let's talk a little bit about this deck. So tonight we're going to focus on Aggro Rogue, which is sometimes called Aggro Rogue, it's sometimes called Backspace Rogue. It's named after a high Legend player back in 2014 named Backspace, who played this list. So tell me a little bit about this. How did you get interested in playing this aggressive Rogue deck in the first place?
Said whenever I first played Classic and tried to get Legend, like the first month or the second month that I was playing Classic, I was mainly playing Control because I was trying to just spice it up and try to counter Zoo. You know, see, it was doing pretty well against Zoo. pyro quality and other shenanigans like that. So I transitioned from I had some interest in playing Miracle, but not really. I lost to very good aggro rogue players, but I didn't really know that aggro backspace. I hadn't heard of it at the time. I had tried Hunter was my first aggro, I could say, so like face Hunter. So I tried the Hunter deck, and then I heard an aggro rogue player, and I saw a couple of, I think it was tweets about people that did really well with the deck. At first glance, I was like, "Wait, is this good?" Like I was skeptical because I just hadn't tried it. I hadn't seen a lot of Oracle, so I was intrigued. And so while Hunter was my choice at the time, because I don't consider myself really a zoo player, and I wasn't really Paladin heard of, but I hadn't really tried either. I just tried the Control Paladin. I thought I would give it a try. Got into trying the deck in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting journey that you went on to kind of figure out like what is the deck I play. And nowadays it's kind of your go-to deck for laddering. Why is that? You've had a chance now in the classic community to play through a couple of different decks, and you've kind of settled on this as sort of your signature deck and the one that you go to for climbing. So tell us a little bit about that. Why this deck above, say, Face Hunter or some other aggressive type deck?
So, in Classic, you have a limited amount of neutral cards and less class cards. So whenever you think why you have to choose a particular class to run a certain amount of a limited class cards and neutrals, there's like pros and cons to it. So for me, like neutrals and rogue, and the benefits of that were using the dagger for pull and cards like coining SI or Avis and just Blade Flurry, like a lot of like action. So for me, while the deck doesn't have like Divine Favor, Aggro Warrior doesn't really have that much draw, and Hunter doesn't really run scavenging their aggressive lists. For me, like just it had a lot of Coldlight Oracle, and using that to close out games, like playing out and once you're starting to lose the board, starting to go face more, and then you Coldlight Oracle into something, or just it's a lot of versatility, and I feel like a lot of fundamentals for like when you should be daggering or what minions you should play and what to expect. And for me, it's just Rogue in general. It's sort of a class, or this deck in particular, where you want to like you just barely have time to kill the, or you've lost the board. Like you rarely have board when you're killing your opponent. And you can now start playing your charge cards. So for me, it's like doing as much damage as you can while controlling the border, like trading as necessary, and then just being able to send the charge face or the burn damage face getting in. So you want to get the job done pretty quickly and control in there somewhere.
No, you kind of alluded to it here a little bit, but maybe we can explore that a step further here, because that's partly the game plan of Miracle Rogue as well. So what's the difference between this aggro list and a standard Miracle Rogue list? Is one better than the other? Kind of describe that to me.
Describe kind of the differences between Miracle and aggro and like the matchups.
Yeah, like what's the difference? What do they do differently? What's the goal of Miracle Rogue? What's the goal of Aggro Rogue, and how are those different?
Sure. So Miracle Rogue sacrifices early board presence in reward for a very. I mean, it's also a very versatile deck because you can conceal, you can shadows. You can go for like a big Edwin. You can use your resources there. You can Shadowstep Earthring Farseer and gain a lot of life. They're very versatile, but you can also play pressure, so you can contest the board early. Having to run so many spells in deck, you run less spells for more, or you just rely on Coldlight to draw you the cards that you need, because you do most of the damage, or Coldlight should be able to finish the opponent off, whether or not you have to Shadowstep it, whether or not you have to play it. In other words, you don't have to draw quite as many cards. It's pretty unlikely that you double Shadowstep Coldlights. Like the most you'll probably ever in a game is 2, and that's kind of pushing it. A lot of times you'll get there with 1. But Miracle Rogue list just they sacrifice the early board pressure threats like Mukla, or you can just like play a 1-drop and coin Mukla, or like one Aggro to get a trade in, or like coin SI Mukla, 1-drop coin SI Mukla, like sacrifice early board damage and then do the burn later. Whereas Miracle Rogue just does kind of stuff later. It survives until it does all of its stuff later.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way to describe it. And also, both decks are going to deal damage some way or another, right? You're just front-loading a little bit more of your damage with Aggro Rogue, and Miracle Rogue just waits a couple of more turns to guarantee they can draw into all of their damage spells and find a way to just KO their opponent.
Yeah, and that's a benefit and a limitation, because you have to run so many spells in Miracle Rogue. You can't get away that much less spells, otherwise your Gadget Sand won't draw.
Right.
Whereas in Aggro Rogue, you can as spells as you want, but you are going to need some minions to get in some damage.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, what do you say? Let's put the deck together and see what we can do with it. So I like to start with the most core cards first, those that we would absolutely not want to do without. So I assume here, Gadget Sand Auctioneer, is that the first one that goes in?
For aggro. Funny.
Right, so that's a big difference, obviously, between Miracle Rogue and this deck, is no Gadget Sand Auctioneer. But
so something quite talk about, but if you play Classic, a reason that like Gadget Sand is the one of the core signatures of Rogue is the very cheap burn. So like Blood, Eviscerate, Shadowstep, all cards that can like do a lot of damage opponent for cheap. You just gotta navigate how to use it.
Yeah.
All of which go into this.
So what would you consider to be the most core cards in this deck? What are maybe your top 3 or top 4 cards that you feel like really define this aggro archetype?
So you have to fight for board with SI7 and dice, where you'll play whatever 1-drop you can have, and then follow up with like coin SI7, or you can do like 1-drop dagger and just eventually getting to your SI7.
Mm-hmm.
I really feel like 7 is a card that gets you back in the board if you happen to lose it early, or it keeps you in board. If you play a 1-drop, you're kind of equal on board to your opponent, then you coin SI.
Yeah, absolutely. SI and auto include in both this and Miracle lists this combo to deal 2 damage. It can also work with Shadowstep as well. Playing against a Zoo deck, sometimes you can get massive value. Coin an SI, kill something, whap into a Voidwalker, Shadowstep it back after it's been damaged. A lot of potential plays with this card, real tricky for opponents to deal with. What's another one?
I'd also definitely include Shadowstep, just because of the versatility with Coldlight or Burn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a lot of different options with it.
There is, so many options.
Yeah, we have, we'll get to a couple of those chargers. We have plenty of chargers to play this with. But Shadowstep, return a minion to your hand. It costs 2 less. So with charge minions, we can use this depending on, it can be Leroy, it can be Arcane Golem. You can even do something as small as a Southsea Deckhand. And also works with those combo cards like SI7 as well. All right, what else are we thinking here?
So do we have to? There isn't a per se what I'm thinking, but should we say mainly class cards, or can we also include like neutral?
Yeah, we could include neutral cards, I think.
Because Leroy is a hard one to not bring up.
I've seen him a couple of times. Yeah, Leroy Jenkins, pretty strong card. Absolutely has synergy with Shadowstep as well. One of the main reasons to play any aggro deck is that we always have this as a finisher, whether we buff him or Shadowstep him. Many decks, even decks like Handlock, can take advantage of Leroy. Alright, I like that inclusion. Leroy's good.
Like we said, the deck really just aims to like do some intro damage with minions and then close out, and there's no better closer than Leroy Shadowstep.
Yeah, that's actually something interesting I was thinking about earlier. Let's put in this Arcane Golem. So and let's say Cold Blood as well. Cold Blood's a very important card in this deck. That 1 mana, 4 damage, very efficient. So if we do the math a little bit, we can see, so Arcane Golem, for 4 mana, we can play Arcane Golem plus Cold Blood or Shadowstep. That's 8 damage total. Leroy's only getting us 6 for 4. And as we increase that amount of mana, as we say like 5 mana, Arcane Golem is now going to be Shadowstep twice. That's 12 damage. Leroy for 5 mana, well, we can do Leroy Coldblood, so that's 10. We're still, Arcane Golem still outperforms Leroy. And when we get to 6 mana and even 7 mana, Arcane Golem plus 2 Shadow Steps plus 2 Coldbloods is always going to actually do more damage than Leroy. So technically a pretty insane amount of burst here that we can put out with Arcane double Shadow Step and 2 Coldbloods.
Thankfully, the math is sort of easy because Leroy is the source of damage that does 6. A lot of rogue things either do 2 or do 4, like Eviscerate. And 2 would be like Deadly Poison, SI, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Even numbers, right?
2, 4, 6.
You can do the odd numbers with your hero power if you want. Now, Shadow Step obviously can work with Leroy, can work with Arcane Golem. There are a couple of other chargers in this deck. What are the other charge minions that we play?
Deckhand. Southsea Deckhand.
Okay. We play 2 copies of him.
Hmm.
Makes sense. Now, we get extra value out of this card because we're a rogue, right? So for just 2 mana, we can always ensure that we have a weapon. So guaranteed 2 damage with this card. We notice that a lot of these cards are guaranteed damage. Leroy is a guaranteed 6. SI is a guaranteed 2 with the possibility to deal 3 more if it hits face. Arcane Golem, 4 damage, direct damage, right? And same with Coldblood. So far we've got a lot of burst damage that we know, as long as there's no taunt, is going to be able to connect with their face.
And Deckhand is also really good if you play a minion on 1 and then dagger on 2. You could do like coin, Deckhand, SI, and just really hard come back on board, killing like 2 targets or 1 like really hard to kill target.
Yeah, absolutely. Having these cheap minions gives us a lot of flexibility in our turns, especially when we're using the coin, right?
A lot of way to control board or go face if you're ahead.
Yeah.
Don't need to trade.
Yeah, kind of like a Leper Gnome or an Abusive Sergeant on steroids, right? It's just we guarantee that damage. We don't have to worry about Leper Gnome being silenced. We don't have to worry about Abusive not having a target. Southsea Deckhand just guaranteeing us that 2 damage connects to their face right away.
And also, Southsea Deckhand plus Coldblood can kill off like a Druid of the Claw or a Sinjin or some big taunt so that your other big chargers can get through or your other big minions can get through. So for 2 mana, not only are you sapping a target, you're killing it and then getting through. You don't have to worry about it again.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, just and having this 1 HP, that's kind of one of the things in general, I think, in Classic that's so important is finding ways as an aggro deck to trade up into your opponent's minions because they will play taunts, and we have to have a way to deal with it, right? So cheap minions like this that can receive cheap buffs like Coldblood, for just 2 mana, we're getting 6 damage, like you say, to clear a 5 mana minion. We can play another thing on top of that. We could play Arcane Golem, if we wanted to as well.
Against other aggro decks, it's like 1 mana kill a Knife Juggler, and you have two more mana to either like get another dagger or play other cards and stuff.
Right, exactly. It can also be a combo activator for SI7 if we need it to be as well. Cheap 1 mana spells like Coldblood. It may be 1 mana, but it's not going to help us to activate our SI most times. But Southsea Deckhand, just a really convenient way for us to activate another card. Now, you had another charger in this list. I was curious about Wolf Rider. Tell us a little bit about that.
So, for Wolf Rider, there are a bunch of scenarios where I like to use it. A bunch of scenarios where I think that it sort of pops off, we'll say. Mm-hmm. Now, I've messed around between 1 and 2. This month I've been trying to do something different, and I've been trying to run 1 sap, which is something I've also messed around with. I've been trying to run 1 Wolf Rider, 1 sap. 2 Wolf Riders isn't bad at all. It's kind of just a tech choice. I mean, sap isn't bad. It's a really good card. But the way that I kind of build decks in Classic and the way that I played it is any time that I sort of go by moments wherever I have 2 of cards in it and it feels bad. So an example is there was a time that I was running double Assassin's Blade, and I had double Assassin's Blade in my hand, and I was like, man, what did I do to deserve this?
Yeah.
Like, I didn't draw Coldlight or draw or charges to finish the game. I just had a weapon I already was swinging with. And so for me, like, running a sap, top decking a sap against Miracle whenever I need something to kill them, and I was like, man, this isn't a good moment. So for me, like, Wolf Rider, while it's not 3 mana for 4 damage like Arcane Golem is, it is nice to have 1 at least to stay flexible with Coldblood and Shadowstep. Like if you if you don't know that you're going to draw a Wolf Rider and you play out an Arcane Golem, and then later on you draw a Shadowstep for the Wolf Rider, or you draw like a Cold Blood for your last Charger, it's just nice to have another Charger in case we've been trading with deckhands and trading with other Chargers.
Yeah, always just, yeah, exactly. And I think this is a common thing that we've seen as well with like Face Hunter decks and Aggro Paladin as well, is one Wolf Rider seems like the right amount. Otherwise, this card is not particularly good against aggro decks. It gets, an Argent Squire can 2-for-1, 2 Wolf Riders, right? That's 6 mana for us, 1 mana for them. So there can be downsides to playing this card. There can be upsides as well. Sometimes, let's say it's on turn 3 and you have a choice. Can you play Arcane Golem and you can play Wolf Rider? You would rather play the Wolf Rider, obviously not to give your opponent a mana crystal. So I find that this one of Wolf Rider gives us a lot of flexibility without maybe making it too weak to a zoo deck, if that makes any sense.
A lot of times against Miracle Rogue or Druid, for example, against Miracle Rogue, the first minion they play costs 3, and it's usually either Earthring Farseer or SI7. So I can either use the Wolf Rider to kill their first minion, or I could kill their first minion, whether I have like a deadly poison up or something. I could like Point and Dagger Deadly, and once that minion is dead, I now know that the rogue player might not have another 3-drop, and I can just drop out Wolf Rider. But while I have my own Wolf Rider on, they probably don't want to face tank it, so they have to use their whole turn to just remove it in some way. In theory, they're not going to, prep something out, and if they do, they lose it off the gadgets in.
Right, exactly. The investment of resources is so awkward for the Miracle Rogue. Like you say, you don't want to take 6 damage to face from a Wolf Rider, but at the same time, do you want to spend turn 3 casting Shiv and passing the turn as a Miracle Rogue? Not really, right?
And against Druid, kind of the similar concept, like, they might wrath something, they might wrath something instead of punching, or Wild Growth. Maybe you see a swipe and then you drop Wolf Rider down. It's just awkward for them to develop into the Wolf Rider. They don't want to just punch it and pass as Druid.
Right, yeah, and this is actually, this is an interesting kind of discussion of how we play aggro decks in general and how we win with them, because some people think it's all about just trotting out your minions whenever, but really what it is, a lot of times at the higher levels, is finding ways to make your opponent's turn awkward, right? Is that they have a certain amount of mana, and they're going to have to deal 1 damage somewhere in there. And they really want to play like that 5-mana Druid of the Claw. But like you say, it feels bad to develop a minion into a Wolf Rider that's already on the board. It takes nothing for us to clear that. But at the same time, on turn 5, if they cast something like Wrath, then they may not have a 3-drop to follow it up with as well. So creating those awkward situations, Wolf Rider does do a good job at doing that a lot of times.
Another really good example of a card that makes it awkward for your opponent is whenever your opponent plays, like we were talking about, like a swipe or some form of removal. And particularly with Druid, you follow it up with Coldlight Oracle. So you draw cards from your deck and you get to play out another minion. So you just can redevelop right immediately after an AoE. Then they have to play into it.
Right. Let's talk about this card a little bit, this Coldlight Oracle. Now, we have a couple options for card draw in Rogue. Traditionally, we see people playing Gadgets and Auctioneer, prep, coin, backstab, draw all the cards, right? We have another option, and this isn't really explored too much in Classic, but we also do technically have Sprint as well that we can use for card draw. But I'm curious, why do we choose Coldlight in this deck? What is the benefit this brings over any of those other sources of card draw that we could use?
So, the problem with Sprint is the mana cost. In this deck, where cards like Prep, you don't really get the effect, and draw just by playing it, like with Gadgetzan. In this deck, if you're prepping out Eviscerate, you're going to have to do, Cold Blood isn't really a good prep, right, because you're not getting your mana value. Eviscerate isn't really a good prep because you're not getting your mana value. And it's you can play a lot of cards to gain control early, but you won't really maintain it. So a lot of the time, the only good prep in the deck would be prep into Sprint if we were running it. And those would be only 2 copies of each in the deck. It wouldn't be completely useless, but it would be semi-useless until we hit the Sprint. Not to mention, we'd be losing board control. So it would only be really good against control, otherwise we'd just completely lose board if we were to prep Sprint.
Yeah.
We'd have to be completely out and looking for burn in order to go the Sprint route. So I really like just playing a Coldlight Oracle, usually not on 3 if you can help it. I like to wait a little bit longer because you don't really want to give your opponent a lot of options going early. You'd rather play out a Wolf Rider or some kind of SI line, or maybe even squeeze in a dagger and just wait a little bit longer. That way you can also draw into a Shadowstep in case you determine you need more cards. But in general, I just think it kind of fits the plan. Like, it's a smaller minion than the other 3/3s and other effects. It's kind of necessary for this deck to have a draw engine.
Yeah, and if we think about it, as far as I really like how you broke it down here as far as mana costs, and you're right. Prep is not a particularly useful card in this deck because we just don't run. It's not a 0 mana draw one like we get with Gadget Sand. So for Prep Sprint, it requires 2 cards and we draw 4, right? For Coldlight, Shadowstep Coldlight, we're drawing 4 cards as well. And we're investing 2 cards. But we also get a 2/2 on the board as well, which can be important, right? Is that there's also a threat. If Coldlight Oracle stays on the board, we may Shadowstep it again and may draw 2 more cards.
And also,
yeah, go ahead.
The idea of Coldlight and the cards you're looking for in that stage of the game, your opponent should hopefully be low enough to where you can just look for cards that go face. So the cards that they draw, like minions that contest, the cards that you're getting are supposed to like help you win the game, like help close out with chargers or help answer the few remaining minions they can play, because not everybody runs a lot of taunts, so you're just getting direct damage with Coldlight a lot of the time, closing out the game. So the 2 cards that your opponent gets doesn't matter as much because they have to protect them in that stage of the game, ideally.
Yeah, so I know that there are a lot of players out there that have serious anxiety about some of the things that we're doing with this deck. Number 1, we're playing Arcane Golem. This gives our opponent a mana crystal. Number 2, we're also playing King Mukla in this deck. We'll talk about him a little later, but I'll put him in there for right now. So we're giving our opponent 2 bananas, we're giving our opponent 2 mana crystals, and we're giving them 4 cards. And I could definitely understand how someone might think that this makes the deck deficient in some way. So to those players who feel anxiety about playing a card that draws their opponent 2 cards, what would you say to those players?
You get what you pay for. For Mukla specifically, the decks in which it is great against are the decks in which case they have a nightmare of a time answering Mukla and doing something. Against Druid, you play a 1-drop and you coin Mukla, or like 1-drop dagger Mukla. They might, if they wild growth and you drop a Mukla on the board, like that's awkward for them. Even if they innervate, like the best they could do is like innervate something out and hope that they can contest the Mukla. But Mukla just goes so hard against Druid because you can like cold blood some of your cheap minions to deal with something they innervate out, or just Mukla's just near impossible for them to kill. Sometimes they'll have BGH or something, but it's just so good against control. Like Miracle Rogue even can sap it, but then you can replay it. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's this 5 HP. I think that's so important. Is that Eviscerate, Swipe, many of these, even Shadow Bolt if you want to put it in there, but a lot of removal in Classic deals 4 damage maximum. There are not many things without spell damage that deal 5 damage exactly, so being able to play this minion early, if we're planning to finish the game before turn 7, 8, something like that, I would assume that Mukla is strong in those situations. The game goes a little bit longer and they're able to plant a taunt on curve and then also maybe get some bananas out. Then certainly that can be a pain for us, but kind of just like a guaranteed 5 damage here. But
it's almost like a non-committal Edwin. Like, you play it when you're ahead. If you can play it when you're ahead, it's insane. Edwin is like, if you can play a lot of cards and if you're, you're a Rogue, that kind of thing, you can kind of play Edwin at any time. But if Mukla is best whenever you're ahead with him.
Yeah, and speaking of Edwin, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think some players also have misgivings of why is there no Edwin in this? It's an aggro deck, right? Where you think Edwin's one of the biggest minions that you can create as a rogue player. So help us understand, why is it that we don't play Edwin in this deck?
So, like I said, when it comes to my deck building, I try to eliminate negative experiences. So, like we talked about, like running too many saps, or another thing we haven't talked about yet is like the correct 1-drops to run. Whether it's like the amount of Worgens, so 2/1 stealth that help you control the board easy, or just help you get the trades you need, versus cards like Abusive Sergeant, which give a minion to attack this turn. Like, Abusive Sergeant is much better when you're trying to close out the game. It's a much better top deck if you have a charger charters in hand that you're going to close out the game with, and you don't want to be drawing Worgen late in the game. So it's kind of like hedging your bets for cards that are always good. So you never want to top deck Edwin when you're low on stuff, whereas Mukla is a slightly better top deck.
Yeah, and we'll run out of stuff eventually here, right? We don't have the same like Gadget's engine that allows us to play 0 mana spells that also it deals 2 damage to the opponent's minion and happens to draw you a card as well, right? So we run out of steam a little bit more quickly than a traditional rogue. So exactly what you're saying, and when we're not running prep and when we're not running backstab in the list, Edwin loses a lot of value. It's hard to get more value out of him. The best we're going to do is playing a 1-drop and playing Edwin on the same turn, maybe with a coin. Or we can use a Shadowstep for it. But those situations aside, Edwin is, like you say, a bad top deck with this. When we're trying to close out a game, we don't want to see a minion that's going to contest the board.
On my Asia account, that was an account I just had Aggro Shaman on, and I eventually got around to crafting Rogue, and I was lucky enough to open up Edwin. So Edwin is a card that I am running in a budget version, so I am trying it out. But I don't think it's as good as Mukla. Certainly not as good against Druid, where they can just silence the Edwin, or Miracle Rogue can sap it. And unlike sapping Mukla is a 5/5 when it comes back into play, and Edwin, you've played a bunch of cards, and you probably can't get it above 4/4 or 6/6, which is, swipe range is a 4/4, and 6/6 is just... You'd be lucky if you could play it big and replay it as that high. Probably impossible.
Right, exactly. Now there's another interaction here that's interesting. That's also worth pointing out, I think, and it's the interaction between Mukla and Coldlight Oracle. So explain to us. We give our opponent 2 bananas and we help them draw cards. How can we use this combination of cards against maybe somebody like Freeze Mage or Control Warrior? How do we use these, or Handlock? How do we use these 2 cards together, the Oracle and the Mukla?
So, whenever you play Mukla, your opponent gets 2 bananas, of course, which are 1 mana spell, give a minion +1/1. So, whenever you add 2 cards to their hand, you can then Coldlight, and the maximum space of hand is 10. So, Handlock in particular, they spend turn 2 tapping. Sometimes even like a Control Warrior or something will hold back cards just waiting for you to do something. And you can destroy their top decks because you both draw cards and you can only hold 10 cards. So Coldlight, while it's actually giving you cards, it's actually removing options for your opponent. Oftentimes, specifically against Handlock. Handlock is the perfect example. They're the deck, I would say, that tends to have the most cards in hand at once on average. You're actually removing them of options and gaining yourself options, and then they have to play out the bananas in order to have the hand space back. So they have to use 2 mana. I was gonna say waste, but maybe they can find a good use of it. They have to spend 2 of their mana to get rid of the bananas to then be a little more comfortable not getting milled again, not burning their good cards instead of having a banana.
Right, and so what we would normally consider a problem with this card, or a drawback to Mukla of giving your opponent bananas, actually turns out to be a strength against decks like Handlock. Like you say, if they've got bananas in hand and they need to dig to their answers, they've got to play those damn bananas out first before they can actually do anything, and that's 2 mana. So in some ways, this is mana burning our Handlock opponents for 2 mana. Which is interesting, and Coldlight as well. Like you say, the Handlock doesn't get the perfect hand every time. That's why they tap so much. And they might end up with a hand that has promising start, but needs to draw into things like Defender of Argus or Sun Fury. And when we play Coldlight, we may just, mill some of those cards or those answers that are really important and valuable for our opponents to come back on the board. So not all drawbacks. Yeah.
Against Druid, where a lot of their minions are 4-drops, like Yeti and Keeper of the Grove and stuff, if you play this on 3, they have to develop a minion and have that stick to then get to use the bananas. So they won't really get to use the bananas because they'll be playing on curve. You don't want to innervate out a minion with bananas on it and have it get sapped or removed with a minion with Cold Blood. Like, they just have to keep the bananas for a while. They might never get to play it because they just want to keep playing minions on their curve.
Yeah.
They might never get the upside.
Yeah, exactly. And being as we're playing a deck that closes the game out quite quickly, it is likely that opponents will not really get the true value of these 2 bananas. A lot of times what I see is somebody, plays a 4-drop and throws a banana on it just because they've got 1 extra mana. And that doesn't really impact our board too much when they do that. A couple other cards I don't want to forget about here. Deadly Poison.
Yes.
So again, kind of with the same theme. Cold Blood, 1 mana, 4 damage. Deadly Poison, same thing. Our weapon, our base dagger, is gonna have 2 charges, so 2 times 2, we get 4 damage off of that. But we also play another weapon in this deck as well, Assassin's Blade. Tell us a little bit about Assassin's Blade.
So I really like 1 copy of Assassin's Blade. I tried 2 for a while, but like I said, I ran into the problem of drawing both. That was very annoying. But what I really like about Assassin's Blade is, let's say you've played out all your cards. The deck tends to run out of stuff to do around, like, turn 6, we'll say. 6 or 7, that's when, if you haven't drawn a Coldlight yet, you're probably out of cards. Realistically, you're pretty much out of cards, or you're saving your burn for whenever it actually kills your opponent. Mm-hmm. So that's where something like Assassin's Blade comes into play, where if you're just saving your chargers to do damage to the face, you can just equip Assassin's Blade. Miracle Rogue doesn't play that many minions. They play their intro minion, their 3-drop, and then they're kind of waiting for like a Drake or a Gadsan. Well, you can just drop this down and start smacking them for 3 every turn, and they can't play a removal spell to deal with it. But another really good highlight of Assassin's Blade is getting to punch into big taunts that it helps kill taunts with Druid, or it just helps the slower matchups like against Control Warrior. Just does a lot of damage, particularly with Deadly Poison. Technically, 20 damage if you Deadly Poison the weapon.
Yeah, exactly.
and it all hits.
Yeah, exactly. This is, I liken it maybe in some ways to Doomhammer, where you equip it on turn 5. You're a little bit ahead on the board sometimes. Well, I suppose there are a couple situations. If we're ahead on the board, Assassin's Blade helps us mitigate some of the damage that a board clear would do, right? Because we're not playing more minions to go into an AoE. So it has that value. If we're behind on the board, then we don't have to play a minion that turn. We can save our chargers that are just going to get pinged off anyway, and we can equip Assassin's Blade and start dealing that damage over the 4 turns with it. Now 4 is a lot of turns, but we have a tool that we can use to deal with that here, is that we can play Blade Flurry. So the interaction here that I see, and maybe you agree with this or don't agree with this, is that when we're talking about Assassin's Blade, 4 turns is a lot, but 3 turns is pretty doable. So if we swing 3 times with this Assassin's Blade over 3 turns, then we also kind of get our last swing in by playing Blade Flurry as well. So in essence, this is kind of like it's a 3/4, but it's really going to hit face 3 times and then get flurried off, right?
So I think, assuming you're not against something slower like Miracle, or Miracle's kind of putting you on a bit of a timestamp, I think you usually get 2 hits and then you flurry on 3. Mm-hmm. So basically you play it on turn 5 or whatever 5 mana you have left. You swing with it initially. The next turn you swing, and if you don't have Blade Flurry, if you're in a position where you can't kill your opponent, you can just draw into Blade Flurry with Coldlight Oracle. Mm-hmm. I've had games where I've played my Coldlight, Shadowstepped my Coldlight, knowing that I have to get Blade Flurry to live, to clear the board and do damage to my face. So Coldlight's giving me cards to do even more damage to my opponent's face, and Blade Flurry is damaging my opponent's face and keeping me alive a turn, so I can play more cards out, kill my opponent the next turn. It's really, really good. Like we talked about, this deck kind of burns bright. You play whatever cards you can early, and then you try to finish them out with chargers. Like, the longer this deck goes, more likely your opponent's probably starting to overpower you. And this is a way where if you finally lost the board, your opponent's finally the one in control, it just destroys their board.
Right.
And goes face.
Yeah, and with Deadly Poison, that brings us up to 5 damage on the Assassin's Blade. So, we're assuming that we can use our life total as a resource, right? Because we're oftentimes ahead in the race. We can afford to take a couple of hits, right? So even things like a taunted out Molten Giant, we can still take those down even with Defender of Argus by smacking it once with Deadly Poisoned Assassin's Blade and using Blade Flurry, likely to clear other minions. Also notable minions that it clears off with Deadly Poison, Ancient of Lore, Gadgets and Auctioneer. There are a lot of different minions that we can clear with this that are high power level creatures that are also significant mana investments from our opponents. Even stuff like Sunwalker, if we manage to get a ping off, There are very few things that survive Assassin's Blade, Deadly Poison, Blade Flurry. Now, do we play 2 copies of Blade Flurry, or do we play 1?
I'm currently running 1. You can try to mess around with 2 if you go like double blade. Like, because usually with Deadly Poison, you're gonna have to play a Deadly Poison earlier in the game if you have the option to, so that you can kill off key targets to remove. Like, for example, the 3-drop from Miracle Rogue, whatever intro 3-drop they play, or just aggro, killing off Knife Juggler. If you don't have a Deckhand or something, you can just Dagger Deadly it. So you usually don't have double Deadly. So if you want to run 2 Blade Flurry, you need to run double Assassin's Blade, which I'm just not a fan of.
Right. It's nice to have the consistency to be drawing into Assassin's Blade in almost every matchup, because it is a pretty good finisher. It puts your opponent on a serious clock. But at the same time, like we were talking about really at the beginning of this, was if you run 2 Assassin's Blades, you could be very sad when you top deck, 1 Assassin's Blade into another. It's a completely dead card, especially if you've already buffed your weapon up. Then you're going to have to wait for your current one to run out of charges. And if we're talking about a 4 durability weapon here, we're almost never going to get value out of the second one.
Another example is, since the deck tends to run out of cards on like turn 6 or turn 7, if you're drawing for more and you don't have an Assassin's Blade yet and you play Coldlight, you're already behind on board if you're drawing and you're low on stuff. And if you draw into an Assassin's Blade, you're not going to be able to play it because you have to kill your opponent like right away. You don't have mana to be behind on board, play a Coldlight, which is a 2/2, not the greatest stats, and then play a weapon the next turn. Like, you're just way behind at that point. You don't have time to equip the weapon.
Right.
You kind of need to get it going before you Coldlight, which is where it's at its best, is delaying a Coldlight a turn, so you have more time to play the cards after the Coldlight, and just more time to swing with the blade.
Yeah, Coldlight and Arcane, I think, are 2 cards that Assassin's Blade helps with. Like you say, it gives us something to do with our 5 mana. And on that turn, if we've drawn Arcane or Coldlight, we may not want to give our opponent 2 cards just yet, or we may not want to give them a mana crystal yet. So having another option there, something that's got a little bit more flexibility, something that's essentially damage over time, that can help us kind of diversify our threats as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Now, we talked a little bit about some of the 1-drops, but let's finish off our suite of 1-drops here. We've got 2 Abusive Sergeants. That's not necessarily 100% guaranteed 2 damage, but it's a body that will almost always be doing 2 damage to their face, whether it's played with a Charger or another minion on the board. What other minions, and we've got our Southsea Deckhand in there, but what other 1-drops do we put in this deck to be effective?
So whenever I analyze or compare 1-drops, I use the categories of, there are things that are better sooner and things that are better later. Already what we have in deck, Abusive Sergeant, better drawn, like later on you can use it with chargers, but you don't want it to be your turn 1 minion. You want to get its effect to give a minion to attack. But while it's not bad as a 2/1, you want to play it on another minion, whether it's the Argent Squire we see right next to it. Divine Shield, getting 3 attack and getting to clear anything is pretty insane, but Argent Squire notably is very good with Dagger, because you could kill like a Knife Juggler, or you can just kill 2 1/1s. It just gives you a lot of options. It'll always do that one. At least that one, if not 2.
Right, and we have pretty slim margins for killing our opponent, right? We don't have the luxury of waiting until later turns or playing sloppy, so we really need to squeeze out every last efficient bit of damage we can. So like you're saying, Abusive on 1, sure, sometimes it can work, but you would much rather this be a 2/1 minion that's already dealt 2 damage to our opponent's face, or help something trade up. And the synergy here with Argent Squire as well, right, is this has Divine Shield, and like you're saying, we need proactive minions to play sometimes that help us advance our board state, not necessarily reactive or charging minions like Abusive or Southsea Deckhand.
Yeah.
So we've got Argent Squire. What other 1-drops should we include here?
Leper Gnome.
Hey, that seems to make a lot of sense. So naturally, again, the same idea. We just want to guarantee that all of these 1-drops are dealing some damage, right? So Leper Gnome, good to play on turn 1. We'd much rather play a Leper Gnome on turn 1 than we would Abusive Sergeant. So Leper Gnome, Argent Squire, these seem like the proactive place that we can start developing our board with.
And Deckhand, you don't really want to play on one because you want to use its ability while you have a weapon, so you'd prefer either Leper Gnome or Argent Squire.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So we've got 4 so far, 4 proactive threats. Do we need any other 1-drops in here?
I do like to run one Worgen Infiltrator.
Mm-hmm.
I play around between Worgen Infiltrator and Abusive Sergeant. I currently, the most Worgens I've been running at the moment are 1. Like we said, it kind of depends on what you're facing, whether you need the 2 damage all the time, or whether you need to just play better minions that fight for board like better earlier. Notably, there are a lot of Zoo players at the moment, particularly if you're new to Classic, you'll face a lot of Zoo. The Worgen is something that's, unless you already have a minion that's sticking and Abusive is buffing it up, Worgen just really helps you to guaranteed get a trade that you want. It won't get shot down by Elven Archer. It'll just really help you make sure you're doing what you can to fight for the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And 2 of them, we were talking a little bit about top deck consistency with Assassin's Blade earlier. When we run those 2 abusives, that's top deck consistency in the late game. It's probably going to help us with the other chargers that we draw. On the other hand, Worgen Infiltrator, great card to play on turn 1. And maybe sometimes a little bit later in the game, but typically we want to be killing our opponent by the time that we're playing Coldlight Oracle, drawing into the rest of our threats. So having 2 of them can be a little bit iffy. I assume that when we mulligan, we probably favor having Worgen Infiltrator in it so that we avoid that situation of drawing a 2-1 that doesn't deal damage this turn later on in the game.
And it's really a preference, because if you want to be better into other aggro decks, or just have just your preference between Worgen or Abusive, like being stronger earlier versus top deck mode, it really depends on your personal preference with the deck. Like, if you want to run double Assassin's Blade, double Blade Flurry, and always have the Blade Flurry going, I'm not going to say it's wrong with you. That's just not the way that I like to play it personally.
Yeah, this is
try to avoid the like you said, the top deck consistency and the negative moments.
Yeah.
Or it's always being good, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. I think that's one thing about Classic that I've noticed more and more and more, is that when we build decks, a lot of times we're cutting cards like Azure Drake that are great cards in and of themselves, but if we have 2 of them in our hand, then it doesn't really do much for us. And we're also in situations a lot where, Miracle Rogue is playing Gadget Zan, or we're playing Coldlight, where we really do need to be top decking those strong threats as opposed to things that have more potential to them. So we got 2 slots left. What do you think? What do we put in here?
Loot Hoarder.
All right, Loot Hoarder. Now there's a choice of 2 drops here. We've got Loot Hoarder, and we've got our Defias ringleader as well. And
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the choice. Why do we choose Loot Hoarder here to cycle rather than playing the class card Defias, which can be 4/3 worth of stats for just 2 mana?
So Defias shines against Zoo. Whenever I was climbing on my alternate accounts, my EU and my Asia, and there was a lot of Zoo, Defias was a budget option I had for other cards I didn't have that I might have just opened in a pack.
Mm-hmm.
Defias gives you the option of coining it out on turn 1 into having Dagger, which is very, very strong against Zoo. But Loot Hoarder helps you draw towards your burn. So again, it's kind of the preference of the way you play the deck. Defias, if you're not on coin, you're going to have to play it on 3 because you never want to play it on comboed. So you're either you have to save a 1-drop for turn 3, which isn't unrealistic. But I like just playing a 1-drop on turn 1, Dagger if it's good, Loot Hoarder if it's not on turn 2. That way you're drawing more cards, so you're more likely to hit your Coldlight, more likely to hit your SI, which you're going to need on turn 4. And you're just more likely to hit anything in your deck with Loot Hoarder.
Right.
So you're being more consistent, but you're sacrificing kind of a bigger board with if you can afford the payoff of comboing it.
Yeah, and when we get to this kind of race phase of the game where our opponent is low and we're starting to think about our own life total, Loot Hoarder can be a really powerful card because all of a sudden if we have nothing left in hand and we play Loot Hoarder, we top deck Loot Hoarder, we don't actually feel too bad about that, and it sets a difficult problem to our opponent where they think, well, I don't want to take the 2 damage from Loot Hoarder, but I certainly don't want my opponent to draw a card that could be Leroy, right? It's like they might take 2 from Loot Hoarder, but they'll take 4, or they'll take 6 from Leroy or 4 from Arcane Golem.
Yeah,
yeah.
since like turns like 6 or 7, or when you run out of cards, you can usually play like Loot Hoarder and a Wolf Rider or Loot Hoarder SI7, or it just works really well with your 3 mana power plays as you're trying to look for more damage or more cards. It just really squeezes in there very well. And one more positive thing about Leper Gnome. Leper Gnome, like we talked about, it's always getting its 2, and the reason it's always getting its 2 is because silence effects are very costly. With silence effects, like the best ones, like Owl, is it just cheapest is Owl. It's pretty mana inefficient to clear this and deal with the board, play a taunt, heal, or whatever, so it's just like always going to get its 2 damage. And if it goes uncontested on turn 1, it's getting its 4 damage.
Yeah, and not only that, it's very painful for classes like Rogue that like to, or like Miracle Rogue, that like to control the board with their dagger early on. They don't want to face down a Leper Gnome that's 4 damage immediately to their face, or they could let it attack, but it's, oftentimes, like you say, silence or cards like Sap, which effectively work like a silence, are not gonna be an efficient answer to this, right?
Exactly. It's not mana inefficient.
Right. Speaking of daggers, I had a question for you. So we have a lot of this really cheap stuff here. Now, when we're playing like Face Hunter, for example, we can afford to play 1-drop and then Hero Power on 2, and play another 1-drop and Hero Power on 3. Kind of walk me through, how often are we daggering with this deck? Do we forego daggering on 2 a lot of times? What's the game plan there with our Hero Power as Rogue?
So one more card that I haven't, I'll bring up as a shout out before we get into this, that I haven't tested with myself too much, is Fairy Dragon. That's another example of a minion that's probably worth playing on 2 instead of Hero Powering, unless you get a very good Hero Power up.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the time, it depends on like if you're saving for combo or how many 1-drops you have in hand, right? Like if you have like 3 1-drops, you're going to want to play a 1-drop on 1 and then 2 1-drops the next turn.
Right.
In this particular list, you're going to find a lot of use of Dagger. So you can usually Dagger on 2, but if not, you will always want to Loot Hoarder on 2 if there isn't any good value for Dagger immediately, like if you're not getting a good trade.
Yeah, and if we look at the curve, one thing that's notable here is that we have 13 1-drops, right? Which does set us up for a triple 1-drop on our first 2 turns of 1-drop, then 2 more. But only 5 cards in the 2 slot, and of those 5 cards, there's Blade Flurry, there are 2 Eviscerates, so not the kind of things we would ever really play on 2. And then Loot Hoarder. So kind of like we were talking about earlier with Argent Squire and with Leper Gnome, it's helpful sometimes to have something proactive that we can put on the board, like Loot Hoarder, as opposed to just daggering on a turn. It can feel like like we're already a little behind in the race, against something like Handlock, if we're playing our dagger on turn 2 rather than a Loot Hoarder, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Fairy Dragon definitely is one that I've seen some other folks running. It's resistant to removals, and if we assume that we're already going to be winning a little bit on the board, Fairy Dragon can be helpful. There is a downside to Fairy Dragon, though, right? Is that it can't interact with our own spells either, which means that if we stick a Fairy Dragon and we have a promising turn where we can use Cold Blood, we're no longer really able to harness that, and that can mean the difference between a Loot Hoarder that deals 6 damage with a Cold Blood and having a Cold Blood stuck in our hand with just a Fairy Dragon on the board. So it's definitely some upsides to dodging backstabs, things like that, but definitely a downside as well, where we can't buff our own minion anymore. We can't Shadowstep it or do anything like that. Any other notable additions, or we've talked a tiny bit about Sap, but maybe this tends to be kind of a contentious choice here of whether or not we play Sap. Now this list has 0 Saps in it right now. Can you explain to us why the choice to have 0 Saps, and under which circumstances would you say it's beneficial for us to introduce Sap into this list?
So the best thing about Sap isn't the aggro matchups per se, because in those matchups you aren't going to remove minions that are very costly. it's going to be a little inefficient. The best thing you can do with Sap against like a Zoolock, we'll say, is remove a minion that's been Defender of Argust. You know, remove a taunt. General best use of Sap is to remove a taunt, or to buy yourself some time. If your opponent has lethal on board, you Sap something, and then you buy yourself one more turn to have the mana or have the cards to kill your opponent. So for me, running Sap, I don't know that I ever ran 2 Sap. If I did, I didn't for long. I've been playing around with 1 Sap this month a little bit, despite there being a good amount of Zoolocks. But I wanted to reconsider it because, like I said, that was one of those things where if I drew Sap against Miracle Rogue and they had like a stealthed Auctioneer, I was crying. But in general, I was just trying to run cards that are always good, and that card definitely can buy you some time. If your opponent plays Azure Drake, for example, you can Sap Azure Drake in the Miracle matchup. You can't really Sap Earthring Farseer. SI7 is like questionable, right? You don't want to do that early, otherwise they'll just replay it and kill something of yours. Like it's very when it's great, and when it's not, it's okay, or it's like bad, you know.
Yeah, and again with top deck consistency, sometimes maybe Sap is a lifesaver off the top, but other times it's just not a source of direct damage. And a lot of times what we need with these decks is just to be fairly certain that when we draw cards, those cards are going to hit somebody in the face, or are going to guarantee us at least some damage, and Sap doesn't do that. Now, it's probably notable that if there's a very druid-heavy meta, I imagine that Sap would be a consideration. What would we take out if we were to put Sap in here? We see a lot of druids or handlocks in the meta. What would we take out for Sap?
So for me, I would take out probably Worgen.
Mm-hmm. It's a one-of. It makes it simple for us. I think that makes a lot of sense. The other one-ofs that we have in this deck are really, not cards that we can take out. Assassin's Blade, Leroy, Wolf Rider probably would want to keep that in there as well, just for consistency at the 3 spot. So Worgen Infiltrator, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So
Worgen and then Wolf Rider would be like the next one, but I wouldn't. I mean, that's definitely the next one on the hitting list, and not as good as a takeout as Worgen.
Right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these matchups, but first, there are a couple of nagging questions I have about this card, Shadowstep, because I think this is one of the trickiest cards to use, to find the right usage for it. Sometimes, we're faced with decisions like, do I keep Shadowstep in hand to use with Arcane Golem or with Leroy, or should I use the Shadowstep to start drawing cards with Coldlight? Now, I know that every situation is different, and obviously it depends. The answer to this depends on the context. But just in general, what are kind of the rules for Shadowstep? Do you feel like this is a card you hold dearly, that's a really valuable resource that you want to keep in hand? Or is it something that you can kind of just play on certain turns if you have a use for it?
So, the most common usage of this card is going to be with your chargers, with Leroy if you're lucky enough to draw them, or the Arcanes. But it is pretty noticeable that Coldlight into Shadowstep can actually even give you more damage or more resources if you're running out of stuff. I would say that use number 1, like priority number 1, would be to just close out the game with Leroy and the chargers and stuff. If you haven't done enough damage and you don't have a direct enough setup, it's going to take you a couple turns to kill your opponent, then you might want to consider playing Coldlight Oracle with it, so you can draw more resources, maybe find a way to get through a taunt your opponent might play, like cold-blooding a minion or something. And then the third use would be SI. SI7's more for the board matchups where you can get away with Shadowstepping that and just really fighting for board control. I find that Coldlight Oracle, Chargers being number 1, and then Coldlight Oracle being number 2 on the Shadowstep list would be the way to go with this card.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think SI, for certain, when we're playing against Zoo, SI seems like the most reasonable use. We don't really care too much about burning the Zoo deck down. We're not going to be able to do any damage at all until we start controlling the board a little bit. So Shadowstep loses a little bit of its value with cards like Arcane Golem when we're playing against really minion-heavy decks, but it gains value because we have cards like SI that we can play. So it seems like against control, we might save it for Coldlight Oracle, or maybe for one of our chargers, and against aggro, we have another option there. So one of the things I like about this deck is there's flexibility built into this Shadowstep card. There are so many battle cries and combos that we can use this with, but it takes some discernment on our part to figure out when we actually use our Shadowstep.
A lot of the discernment is getting as much as we can with it. Like, for example, we can Shadowstep the Deckhand. That'll only do 2, and then the Shadowstep only do an additional 2 damage. And we can also Deckhand Abusive, but same thing. Another niche use of Shadowstep, which is extremely rare, is like Shadowstepping Mukla. If you play Mukla while you're ahead, and your Mukla has to get in a big trade, your opponent probably isn't going to have a 5/5 of pressure on one minion. So you can kill like a 3/3 or just a significant stat line with this, and then Shadowstep it, replay it for 1 mana. Your opponent might have 4 bananas, but they have 0 board because you got a 5/5 again, and you just took 3 damage and killed a 3-drop with it and replayed your 3-drop for 1. Like,
you end up just giving them a whole bunch of bananas rather than just 2. That's interesting. Value trading in with Mukla. There are other situations too, like a Chillwind Yeti is something that we could ram our Mukla into. Our Mukla's got 1 HP. By Shadow Stepping it, we essentially have a heal for 4 for 0 mana, or for 1 mana to replay
Druid of the Claw too. Mm-hmm. If you like Daggered on 2, Mukla on 3, and they ramp Druid of the Claw, you could just trade in your Dagger and your Mukla and then replay it, and you killed the big taunt, and your other stuff can go face.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this deck fares against some of the other common meta decks, let's start with control. So generally speaking, how do we do against control decks with this aggro deck?
So which all decks are we throwing into the control category? Are we going Paladin, Warrior? Is there anything else we're throwing in?
I suppose that priest is kind of in there. I suppose we could consider priest as sort of a control deck as well.
Yeah, that's pretty good way of putting it. So of those 3 lists, I would say that Warrior is the scariest. And the reason that Warrior is the scariest is because they have the best early options. They can coin an Armorsmith, coin the 2/2 the Taskmaster that deals 1. So if you play a 1-drop and they coin the 2/2 that does 1 to it, it just gets you off to a rough start. If they coin that or coin Armorsmith, you're just not really lowering your opponent to a lower HP off the bat, and it's pretty good at eating up a couple of your cards, a couple of your minions. Where Warrior shines is it takes them a while to be able to kill you. Like where this deck shines against them in the matchup is it takes a while for them to be able to kill you. So once you overcome their initial start, which may or may not be good into you, usually is pretty good. They have pretty good cards to start out with and counter your early start. But where it shines against Warrior is you have time for like Coldlight Oracle. The Metalists don't run a lot of taunts, so your charge cards will go face. It's just they do a very good job at negating damage in the early game and just holding their removal for the right time. It can be hard to burn them down, particularly with armor. The downside of clicking a Hero Powers Warrior is you're not playing cards to contest the board. So you gotta kind of get the Warrior matchup very well. It's a little intimidating just because whenever you're playing aggro and you're having a hard time developing against a deck, they're just easily gaining armor off their Armorsmith or just Fiery War Axing your minions down, and it's sort of intimidating to have a rough start and have your minions answered seemingly insignificant so early. The Warrior's intimidating, but you just gotta stick with it. It's not the worst matchup ever. You can definitely Coldlight scam them or even mill them like we talked about earlier. You just gotta patient.
What kind of cards do you think we would want to look for in our mulligan against Warrior? Because when we play cards like Argent Squire, like you say, there's the chance that they just coin Armorsmith, and we may not have a good answer that deals with it. Do we want to be mulliganing for a lot of these 1-drops still, or are there other cards like maybe Assassin's Blade or Coldlight that we're looking for instead?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because Warrior has so versatile of options. For example, if we choose something with 1 health, like Leper Gnome, then they coin out a Abusive on it, it just kills it right away. Whereas it wouldn't kill the Argent Squire, it would just give it 3 attack and pop the shield. So it's really interesting because like there are some cards that are good around others and some cards that are bad towards others. I do agree that in the Warrior matchup, since you know it's going to run the test of time because they can't kill you until way later, you can get away with keeping like Coldlight Oracle if you have a 1-drop already. And in general, since we run so many 1s, you can probably just, even if you don't have a 1, just toss your other cards and hope for a 1.
Right.
Because we run so many 1-drops. But another example of cards that are good against control specifically, or where you might be ahead or your opponent will have to play a big removal spell to answer it, critical removal spell to answer it, would be King Mukla.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we play this against Priest, we're going to get Shadow Word Death, but that's 3 mana for 3. That's okay with us, probably. Against Warrior, they have Execute.
I don't know if a Priest would keep it against Rogue, because Miracle Rogue, it would just be Edwin,
right.
you know?
Right.
It would rather spend another spell to kill something that happens to be Cold Blood against Miracle Rogue.
Right.
So they would rather look for other stuff like Northshire Cleric.
And probably the same thing with Warriors as well, right? Warriors not going to mulligan, not going to keep Execute in their mulligan against Rogue most of the time, because they're just removing the Rogue minions, right? They just take out their axe and they whack any Rogue minion and pretty much kill it. Miracle Rogue, that is. So Mukla sometimes can get a little bit of value based if your opponent doesn't know what deck you're playing on the ladder, and you get to play this Mukla out. It may be uncontested by somebody who was caught unaware.
So it's very interesting because we were talking about multiple control decks. Control Paladin is kind of the opposite of Control Warrior. Most of Warrior's really good minions to answer early game aggression cost 2. Paladin, they don't really have good early game minions to run. Some lists run double Argent Squire.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll try to get away. Like using Pyromancer, you gotta have more mana for spells. And like Consecrate and stuff, it's just expensive. It costs 4. By then, you can just develop a Mukla or develop other stuff, right? Like they don't really have great 1 or 2 that they can play that they don't want to save for something other than sometimes one of Argent Squire and Control Paladin.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that Paladin, a lot of their tools come later on. They're able to clear any board that they want, but it costs them a little extra mana to have stuff like Pyro Equality or Equality Consecrate. Whereas, like you point out, Priest and Warrior, they do have some of those low mana options, right? They have maybe Holy Smite, they have Pyro Coin, Power Word Shield, or maybe they use your bananas against them and play Pyro with a bunch of bananas. So maybe the approach is a little bit different when we're talking about Control Paladin specifically, of trying to kind of stick stuff on the board early on, make it awkward for our opponents to deal with. Keep
Sap would also be better than Worgen against Control, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Because like the AoE that Control has will just kill the Worgen. Whereas Sap, if they remove your board and they play something, you can just sap what they played. Or if you're behind on board and you're kind of dying and you need a little more time, you can sap whatever's threatening to kill you, and then have a little more time in order to get out your burn stuff or draw for more stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's another thing where it's better against Control than it is against Aggro.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, let's talk a little bit about mid-range decks, and by mid-range I would definitely include Druid. I would say, maybe for lack of a better umbrella, Miracle Rogue and Handlock might also be considered somewhat mid-rangey, somewhat control-y. They kind of do their own things. But how does this deck generally do against some of these S-tier meta decks?
Sure. So I remember I heard Handlock. It was Handlock, and which were the other two again?
Handlock,
Miracle Rogue, and what was
Combo Druid was the other one.
Combo Druid.
Yeah.
Okay, so against Handlock, this deck is very good at setting them below 10, we'll say. At least below 10 by the time they play Drake. Or Mountain Giant, whatever they start out with. And the problem with that for them is there are cards like Eviscerate, or even the Bleed Flurry, and stuff that we can save to go face. So the Handlock player has to decide, by the time they drop their first minion, it's not taunted or anything. They have to decide, they have to have like exactly heal and taunted on turn 5. You're only taunting one giant in theory. Maybe 2, we'll see, but At that point, they're just very low because Handlock doesn't do much to answer in the early game.
Right.
You're not going to get OTK'd with 2 giants on the board.
Right.
So you have a little bit of time to draw for the burn spells. But particularly running Sap also to just get rid of big giants. Or just cold-blooding. You could even just have 1 cold blood and send the minions that you have on board through their big taunt. Not be threatened at all. It's just really hard for them.
Right. Reimagine,
In my opinion,
like, Deckhand, if we stuck a Leper Gnome, then Deckhand plus Cold Blood plus that Leper Gnome is taking down an 8 HP taunt minion, right?
Yeah.
We're only spending 3 mana on that to trade up, and we're getting 2 damage out of the Leper Gnome as well. So we have options to kind of abuse those minions that are high attack but low HP and trade into things like that 1 big taunt per turn. Obviously, we can't continue to 2 or 3 for 1 ourselves on those, but the game will be over by then anyway, right?
Kind of surprised that not many handlock lists that I see on ladder don't run Doomsayer. Because really the only thing they're doing in the early game is like Mortal Coil, Earthring Farseer. Generally they just tap a lot, to be honest. Like tap on 2, sometimes on 3 even.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. In fact, my success with Handlock has mostly come with Doomsayer lists rather than some of the more traditional lists with like 2 Siphon Souls, things like that. I found that that Doomsayer is a good way to stop aggression for this deck as well, right? If we've got Argent Squire on 1 and we're all ready to go with 2 more 1-drops and they play a Doomsayer, it's a really awkward thing for us to deal with, right? We really don't want to see Doomsayer and lose our tempo early against that deck.
The removal that Handlock runs is like Hellfire, so that's stuff that damages them. And if they aren't low enough to play Molten Giant, then it's just helping us. And if we have like an an Argent Squire on the board, it still sticks, and we can still cold-blood it or still continue to do damage.
Yeah, absolutely. This Squire very good with Cold Blood as well. Worth mentioning the synergy here with a Divine Shield minion that can be cold blooded. It's very hard to deal with. An Owl is probably the best bet from the Handlock player or from any other control deck, but not too many decks play Silence, and Handlock probably the most notable one that actually plays an Owl in the deck. So how about the $1 million question? How does it do against Miracle Rogue?
So it's supposed to be one of the better decks in the game versus Miracle Rogue. Can definitely lose to it. It's not going to win every single time. But the deck is very good at just getting a chip damage early, a little bit of damage early, and then starting to just kill them with chargers. The difficulty is whenever they set up a big conceal play, an early Edwin, or just out of range because they are setting up Farseer or Shadowstep. But in order to get away with Farseer or Shadowstep, they have to have a board that kills you. They can't just heal 6 and pass,
Right.
Then you're just going to deal a lot to them.
So when we're talking about the Rogue matchup, we have a lot of the same tools that they have, right? Like they have the same burst with Shadowstep, except that we have just numerically more burst than they do with cards like Arcane Golem. Now, we don't get to cheat with prep, so maybe their damage potential, if they have the perfect hand, is a little higher. But on average, we're going to be able to do more burst damage than they'll be able to do most of the time.
Worgen Infiltrator is another example of a card that is good on 1 against Rogue, but a lot of the time they have to face tank your 1 minion anyway, or choose to shiv it. The Worgen Infiltrator is better against Shiv, but it's just worse later. Just another example of against Rogue where they have like Fan of Knives or something, or Blade Flurry. If you play it later, it's not going to be as good as other options.
Right, it gives them a use for a card that they might not otherwise have had a use for later on in the game. No, I would agree with you. I think that this is generally a favored matchup for us against Miracle Rogue. Just being able to get a couple of minions on the board and be ahead of our opponents. We also still have tools like SI and Assassin's Blade. If our opponents manage to find some way to clear our entire board, we still have these ways to deal with it. But oftentimes, they're not going to be able to set up a good removal turn by the time we have a little bit of board presence already, right? Whether it's with Leper Gnome, Abusive, Argent Squire, or in great, fantasy cases, an Argent Squire that got cold-blooded on turn 2.
Yeah, so the nightmare moments against Miracle Rogue are whenever they play a bunch of cards and they get a big Edwin. That's Nightmare Moment number 1. Nightmare Moment 2 is they aren't close enough to dying, and they have their Gadgetzan concealed. They can do your stuff with like backstabs, prep, some of it's still left over as they're cycling towards it. And just play versatile from them. They can heal and we can't.
Right.
We can just heal out of range. The Miracle Rogue deck, our deck can't heal, just the way it is.
Yeah, and we trade it off. We have a little bit extra burst with Arcane Golem, but we have, no option, like you say, to heal. So in a race, we really don't want to get behind on the board. We almost always want to be ahead in life total and a little bit ahead on the board, because at some point, they'll definitely swing it back in their favor, and we need to be prepared to just, fire off our last charge minions and finish off the game.
Can I talk about maybe the weirdest, the weirdest game I had versus a Miracle Rogue?
Please.
So it was a matchup versus Phasure, and he was playing Miracle Rogue, and I was playing Aggro Rogue. And like I talked about, the nightmare scenarios, I played Edwin on 3. I don't remember if I was going first or second or what. I know it was on 3 mana. Sorry, not Edwin. I played King Mukla. Mm-hmm. We played King Mukla on turn 3. It was a 5/5. Phasure then sapped the Mukla and replayed Edwin. So it was a big 6/6, whatever, Edwin, maybe even bigger, to be honest. I don't remember the stat line, but basically killed my early 1-drop and then developed a big Edwin. My follow-up was his dagger, his spells, whatever, will kill little minions if I play little minions. And if I play Mukla, it's small, it's a 5/5, The 6/6, the 8/8, the whatever the Edwin stat was, is not going to do it for me. So having seen 1 sap from the opponent, I played King Mukla and then cold-blooded it.
Oh,
so we put in a 9/5 Mukla to deal with his 8/8 Edwin, I believe it was, is my guess.
And was he able to remove it?
No. So, obviously scary. You've seen 1 sap, they're not likely to have the other one, right? But being that they had to sap the first Mukla, it's not a bad option to sap Mukla if you're going off with Edwin. But the really weird thing about that game was the cold-blooded Mukla stuck, but Phasure made the right call of going face with his. Mm-hmm. So I had to decide if I was going to be the aggressor or if I was going to trade and hope that they don't have Gadgetzan or don't have Leroy stuff to kill me right away with the Edwin damage they got for the Edwin damage they got.
And ultimately, how did that game end up?
I lost. I had to go face. I decided to trade. It was really awkward for me because I didn't get much damage. It wasn't a very clear-cut decision, and I'd actually never had a game where they sapped my Mukla and developed an Edwin, and my Mukla cold blood stuck. And the other player didn't just trade, wasn't afraid of my higher attack Mukla. Well, I hadn't got much work done that game in terms of killing my opponent. So I made the decision to trade because I was scared because Edwin hit me in the face and I hadn't done any work. But I ended up having Leroy Shadowstep and needed to go face. But I think Phasure said that I would have lost if I would have traded anyway, so I was kind of screwed. But it was a really interesting line.
Yeah, we don't see too many situations in which Cold Blood is used just to buff a minion before it even attacks, right? Almost always we keep Cold Blood in hand and expecting to use it later. But to play it on turn 4 with King Mukla to just say, hey, here it is, it's got 9 attack, unless you have Eviscerate and Shiv or whatever removal you need, or, Thalnos Eviscerate. It at least gives your opponent the opportunity to make a mistake, right?
Right, you always want to use Cold Blood to always get that 4 right away, exactly what you're saying. Right. So it was so weird to just say, okay, here's my 9/5 Mukla instead of my 5/5 Mukla. Do what you will with it.
Yeah. Now, how does this deck tend to do against other aggro decks? There are a couple different types of them. Let's start off with the obvious one, Zoolock. How does this deal with Zoolock?
So the deal with Zoolock is, if you're going second, you're favored. Mm-hmm. If you're going first, you're not.
And I assume that has a lot to do with the coin and SI and Shadowstep.
And Zoo is actually probably my most practiced aggro v aggro matchup, just because of like climbing the legend on NA and Asia and EU and just different servers. And Zoo is the most common deck I'd say on the way up there. So I'll hit any rank.
And what kinds of mulligan choices do we want to make? Now, obviously, if we have the coin, SI makes a lot of sense. Do we keep SI if we're playing against Zoo and we don't have the coin?
If you're playing against Zoo and you don't have the coin, you probably have to. You're gonna play a 1-drop. Hope that you get some kind of value out of Dagger, because usually like Loot Hoarder, for example, on Loot Hoarder on 2 can be okay. But if your opponent goes for like a Priestess line or something, the stats are just kind of being undermined because your opponent is having more stats than you.
Right.
You can keep 1-drop Loot Hoarder. Just kind of awkward if you decide if Dagger ends up being good. They don't. If you play, for example, not Argent Squire, let's say you're just left with like Leper Gnome, that a 2/1 is like our average stat line. If you don't get like Worgen, or if you don't get Argent Squire and you're just left with a 2/1, they can also like Elven Archer it. Some lists run.
Right.
So it's very awkward.
Yeah, and Voidwalker also a really awkward card for us to deal with, because basically outtrades every single one of our 1-drops, right? Maybe best case we end up with a Worgen that gets abusive, but even then, that's still wasting 1 damage. Argent that gets abusive maybe are our only option. What do you think of keeping like Deadly Poison Blade Flurry?
So I do keep that against Zoo, and the reason I keep it is because that's the scam. If you fail to develop better than them, and Zoo will always outdevelop you. It's not a question of like who will play like better minions. Like the pro of Zoo is you're getting to play a lot of minions and then drawing more, whereas this deck cuts minions that it could be running for cards that do a lot of damage for cheap.
Right.
So we sort of have to use a lot of our burn, like Eviscerate, for example, to clear minions, or cold-blooding a minion to kill a Zoo minion. Like for us, Zoo just has more minions, and they have more 1-drops. In any relevant early mana hostage, they're going to have more options there, and they're just going to have more minions to play on that curve level. So they will always have more minions and eventually have the board.
And once they have the board, I would anticipate that our only way back in is either to A, burst their face as they're tapping and catch them unsuspecting, although that seems like it's less likely given that most people, human beings that play Zoo at least, will understand the potential of this deck. So Deadly Poison, Blade Flurry, may be kind of our great equalizer in that matchup. No, it's unlikely that we get both of them in our opening hand, especially with a single copy of Blade Flurry. But certainly if we get both in our opening hand would be an absolute keep, I would think.
If you see Blade Flurry in your opener and you're going first, like first is just extremely unfavored, you're going to have to keep Blade Flurry. And if you're going second, you can keep Blade Flurry because you're more likely to get Deadly Poison, but also because it's like the best thing you can do in that matchup. Really the best thing.
Yeah, even a 1-mana Blade Flurry is probably still doing some good for us, right? More so than any other card that we're able to play early on, like Eviscerate or even some of these 1-drops. I mean, obviously Argent Squire is going to be a good turn 1 play against Zoo, but eventually we're going to need something like a Flurry to help us clear.
Because Zoo is so minion heavy, there aren't a lot of minions like SI7 in Zoo that do damage right away. They don't really tend to run cards like Wolf Rider that have immediate effect. It's more like cards that are really good at just building up a board. Like Voidwalker, Flame Imp, just minions that are really good for cheap cost. So if you can play a 1-drop, and then follow it up with a Dagger, or like Coin SI, or like 1-drop Dagger, and eventually like Deckhand SI, basically if you just remove the board and you just have a 3/3 SI on there, have to just Soulfire it to get away, because if they develop into SI, you're just going to get a really good trade of your choice. Right. Get to develop as you would like, or just Shadowstep it and kill another thing, and then they just lost board for 2 turns in a row. Yeah. They just have to Soulfire it, lose a card, so lose a good creature they could have played. It's just a nightmare scenario for Zoo, where you just deal with their first couple of early turns and you get to control the trades.
Yeah, and I think SI is kind of our great equalizer there. So it sounds like SI, Deadly Poison, Blade Flurry, all pretty strong in that anti-zoo matchup. Now there are other decks that kind of do the same thing as us, decks that burn us with Leper Gnomes and all of the stuff that we use as part of our tools. Is this just a coin flip against those?
Talked about it a little bit earlier, but another budget consideration, or just a good consideration in general, against Zoo, like if you're only facing Zoo, I actually think that Loot Hoarder is worse than Defias, just because it gives you more options. Like having a 2-1 against Zoo leaves you that much more likely to control the board in the early game against Zoo.
Right.
Go like 1-drop and then Dagger, and then 3's an awkward turn if there's like not a good Wolf Rider. Just very awkward, so you can go another 1-drop into Defias. So if all you're facing is Zoo, you can cut the Loot Hoarders, because like cards you get just aren't going to swing the board off Loot Hoarder. It's actually better to just have a better shot at controlling the board earlier. That's like a aggro to aggro specific. Particularly with Zoo, Defias is the best.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As we climb on the ladder, obviously we had certain pockets of certain decks, and if we look back and we see last 5 games have been against Zoo, and we anticipate that we're going to face more Zoo, it seems very reasonable to start subbing these out. And what's the worst that can happen, right? Is that we get to experiment and we get to learn a little new, a little something. So.
It's crazy the night and day realities between being on the coin and not being on the coin whenever it comes to the Zoo matchup.
Yeah. SI,
it's just crazy different win rate.
Yeah, these combo cards. We don't have prep and we don't have backstab, right?
So much more versatility.
Yeah, those 2 cards so important for activating our combo. I mean, as Miracle, we can even just play prep SI on turn 3 and call it good if we need the battle cry for it. But yeah, this deck, we don't really have that option. Our only 0 mana card is Shadowstep, and that's removing something of our own from the board, so not exactly what we want. Alright, well that was a lot of talking. What do you say? Do you want to play a couple of games with this deck and see how it does?
It's good to me.
Alright, cool. Let's queue up with this.
All I ask is that we don't face a Zoolock going first. That's all I ask.
Oh, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's either going to be Zoolock or Zoobot or Warrior Bot. If it is Zoo, though, we got our Blade Flurry.
I was kind of curious if there were Warrior Bots, because I've seen people make a bunch of really nonsensical plays.
Yeah, they know how to push that button. Alright, what do we keep in this matchup?
So I'm definitely down to keep Loot Hoarder, and then we're always tossing away Blade Flurry. Choice is whether or not we want to keep Abusive Sergeant as just a 2-1 that we can make better use of later, or if we want to keep it now. And I'm kind of fine with keeping it now, because the 2-attack stat line is very good against Cleric, unless they have Cleric Power Word Shield. So I'm just going to say, okay, we're going first. We don't get a lot of chances to get a better 1-drop. The Argent isn't better. Leper Gnome's kind of the same, but better. So I'm probably just going to keep this Abusive and keep the Loot Hoarder versus Priest. Obviously, we would want to see like a Mukla or a Coldlight, but I'm pretty happy with the 1 and the 2 here.
Yeah, and we do,
Dagger.
Yeah,
Dagger is not going to be great against Priest on 2, unless it like kills some minions. So Loot Hoarder was pretty good. So
yeah, that's a good point.
The Argent, the Abusive on the left will be the card we play, because we want to save the deckhand for trading and stuff, perhaps on turn 3.
That makes sense. Yeah. Always kind of a toss-up. I mean, they kind of do the same thing. They're both 2 damage cards. So Loot Hoarder on 2?
Yeah, I definitely want a Loot Hoarder here.
Okay.
We could go like Dagger and then Deckhand Cold Blood. I think that it's better to have more options, and if our opponent were to go like Pyro, anything, our board would just get easy removed.
Yeah. Now, do you think it's worth playing the SI here without the combo?
So let's think about pros and cons. Again, we're really afraid of... I would much rather save it, but the reason is because if they were to have like Pyro Holy Smite, or even like Pyro Shield, it would just go up to like 3 health, and we would be a little wrecked. Right. I really actually just want a Dagger here and not even play Deckhand, and just send the 2 face without playing Deckhand. Because next turn, we don't really want to Cold Blood our opponent's minion if they Pyro. The question is, and this is something that we haven't talked much about, do we want to swing? Because our hand says we're going to go Deckhand plus size 7 next turn. So I'm probably not going to swing this turn, but we are probably going to swing on 4 and 5. It just depends on whether we get Coldlight or what we get. That's something, one of the biggest questions with this deck, particularly against control. Okay, we played around this very well.
Nice.
Played around this very well, best we could. Another thing is we did get that card off Loot Hoarder, so that's another reason to not have swung, because we have more cards to potentially have to play.
Right, yeah, still looking for our Deadly Poison there. So what do you feel like Leper Gnome plus SI here is good, or would you rather start charging this guy in face?
We just Leper Gnome here, and then we SI7. We still want to save the deckhand for Cold Blood capabilities on a taunt. Mm-hmm. Just charge damage later.
Yeah, also worth mentioning that this Leper Gnome loses value once we move into turns 5 and 6 with the coin here, because they can steal it, right? And then we don't get that free 2 damage off of it. Alright, that's a big Blade Master. Is that something that we want to kill, or are we just going to ignore it?
So, Priest is at too much life for us to just go all face and let minions stick. We'll actually lose damage over time by having less creatures. Mm-hmm. The AoE that's likely to come down is Holy Nova. So, if we go Deckhand plus Cold Blood, the Deckhand, and then swing and dagger, the face damage doesn't matter much against Priest to ourselves. Mm-hmm. Play I want to do is like Deckhand, Cold Blood, the Deckhand, that's 6, and then you swing in with dagger, and that's 7. Mm-hmm. Then we get to re-dagger too. That way, it's kind of hard to kill a 1-attack and a 3-attack minion. We've already seen Pyro number 1.
Right.
So instead of like cold blooding the SI and losing our big minion, I'd rather just use the Cold Blood here on the Deckhand.
Probably on Leper Gnome to trade it off, right?
Yeah, to get the effect. Yeah. Technically the same, and then Deckhand face, and then swing there, and then yep.
And you think re-dagger?
That way we just get the effect off, and yeah, re-dagger.
Makes a lot of sense. I like this idea of playing around Holy Nova there, preserving this 3 HP minion. That is a little bit tougher to deal with for them. Holy Smite in Classic only does 2 damage, of course. Okay.
Oh.
So it's good that we used the Leper Gnome there, otherwise we wouldn't have gotten that death rattle off. Okay, what are we thinking here? It's a little tiny bit awkward.
Yeah, so other thing, whenever we were talking about the lists and like way that we like to build it, this right here is another very clear moment where Worgen is worse than Sap. Because if we had Sap here, we could remove the 4/5 dagger and then be pretty clear to do whatever we want. But now it's very awkward.
Yeah, what's going through your head here as far as considerations?
So this is extremely awkward. I think we're going to play the Worgen. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to hit the 2/1 with our dagger. Mm-hmm. We're going to send the 3/3 face, because we can't really be trading much anymore. I don't think we can kill the 4/5.
Right. How do you feel like there's any merit to playing, like, trade the SI into the 2/1, Shadowstep the SI back, and then use Eviscerate on this, or is that too many resources?
No, we're going to have to save the Shadowstep for a charger we draw or Coldlight.
Right. So send this guy face. Are we doing anything else here on this turn?
Dagger.
Get that dagger back up.
We're very desperate for Loot Hoarder, but mainly Coldlight. A little sad that we don't have it yet. Mm-hmm. An Assassin's Blade, like we talked about, would have been good here. Wow, that is expensive clear for a 2/1.
Yeah.
Holy moly.
All right.
Got it, baby. We got the Coldlight.
All right, here he goes. Let's see if we Shadowstep him, too. All right. Got Mukla, actually. Do you think we could play Mukla first and Shadowstep second? What are you thinking here? We also have Eviscerate in hand.
So we are going to Shadowstep the Coldlight here, so let's just do that.
Okay. And play it right again?
Now, I like... So we're always going to play Mukla. I'm just trying to think. Play Mukla here. Trying to think about mana for next turn. It is pretty safe. Yeah, wait. How many cards does our opponent have in hand? Do we mill them? Looks like we mill them.
Yeah, we're going to mill them for 2
so
cards.
We play the Coldlight here, and we actually get the mill effect, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see.
It's debating Deckhand, but this is just better.
All right, nice. And we got our
We're always going to swing face for 1 here. Mm-hmm. So our opponent's going to spend their mana developing, and we just, wow, a 0 mana silence. I didn't... I think our Leper Gnome's already died. Okay, so we are in all face mode, particularly with the Blade Flurry, and we do not really have ways to kill this anyway.
Right. So it makes sense to play Assassin's Blade here. To me, it seems like Assassin's Blade plus... we could opt for Wolf Rider.
I'm counting the damage here. Leroy plus Wolf Rider plus Deckhand is 9, 11, plus the 1 is 12. So we can go weapon here, and then Wolf Rider the face. That way we have our cheap Eviscerate to play next turn, and our Blade Flurry. Eviscerate plus Blade Flurry should make its way through just about any taunt they can play. And then we'll have Leroy... Gotta be careful with the Deckhand, because if we lose our weapon, Deckhand won't be able to swing, but it looks like they're not playing a taunt.
Oh.
Dead. Away. Oh, sad, dude.
Nice. Credit to our opponent here. That was a nice little finish. Not often that you see a priest killing you from whatever we were at there. 14.
Just got the cold light a turn late was the problem.
Yeah.
If we cold lighted, even if we threw it into the Holy Nova, we got to play the blade sooner and win. We just kind of did nothing for a turn, and they got to push.
Yeah. How do you feel?
Good, like you said, good credit to them.
Yeah.
And again, the whole like Sap versus Worgen thing. Sap would have also bought us more time there.
Yeah.
I am running one Sap at the moment. I'm signing back in on the Sap. Yeah, it's just interesting. You can already tell like tech cards and choice of cards and what they do.
Well, also I want to. Let's do our mulligan first. Leper Gnome, Evis.
I would keep Leper Gnome and toss the other two.
My concern here is, well, of course we don't have an activator for Eviscerate, but we also
Eviscerate,
don't have a good answer to the
You would mainly use Eviscerate to kill the Armorsmith.
Right.
If they have the 2/2, it's not as good. It's still good, but not as good. And we just prefer stuff like Coldlight and stuff like King Mukla.
Right, thinking a little bit more long term.
Definitely against control, think long term.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got our choice here, Leper Gnome or Argent. What are you thinking?
So if we play the Argent, we look like we're bad into Armorsmith, but not really, because we can dagger Deadly. And it's really good into the 2/2, so I prefer the Argent here.
Now, what I was going to say earlier, that I like that you pointed this out, is that whenever we're putting a tech card in there, like Worgen Infiltrator instead of Sap, as soon as we start playing the game, every time we draw this card, we evaluate, in this situation, would I rather have the Worgen or would I rather have the Sap? And it can kind of help us make that decision where it's like, wow, this is like 4 games in a row where it was painful not to have Sap.
Yeah.
Right? And then every time, instead of saying, oh, I lost, that sucks, we say, well, how would this deck have functioned differently if I had traded this card out? So just making sure to always be prescient of the choices that we've made and ways we can improve those.
So the Warrior, like we talked about, the cards they have is the... So I want to just dagger here and not even swing with it quite yet. The reason that I want to do this is because if they play Armorsmith, we can punish it. If they play 2/2, we can punish it. There's anything they can do. So I want to see what our opponent's doing here. And I don't want to swing. Usually against Control Warrior, you swing a lot eventually. But since we have Deadly Poison, we want to be mindful.
Right.
Really interesting play there. Maybe they're drawing for an Acolyte,
Yeah, I suppose.
So we kind of got... In this scenario, since they didn't play a minion, we got a little punish for not swinging one, but it's okay.
Yeah,
I want to play out a Leper Gnome. I want to swing, and I think I'm just going to re-equip because we want to still stay pretty. Just having a lot of options, not playing too hard into removal.
Yeah, I like this approach a lot. I think that sometimes it can feel like, oh, we got to kill the warrior because otherwise they're going to gain this massive amount of armor and we're going to lose the game. But
here's the Acolyte.
Yeah, there he goes.
Did they draw into that because they shield blocked? I missed what card where it was exactly.
We've got 1, 2, 3. I think that was off the top. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so wow, that actually paid off for them. Interesting.
Not often.
I like Deadly Poison. Hitting the 1/3. I do like playing out the Loot Hoarder here because we are looking for some pretty good options and we're pretty much forcing removal. He can't really develop into our weapon and our power, so...
Right, and it's one of those cards where we don't feel pressured by their removal spells. The Loot Hoarder, in a way, it's like, well, if you're going to spend a whirlwind on it, then at least I'm going to get a card out of it, right? And
The idea, hopefully. Yeah, see, the 4/3 is just bad here. You can kill A2-1. What?
something's wrong with this one's programming. Well, I would love to play Mukla here. Is there any reason not to play Mukla and maybe re-equip a dagger?
So I kind of want to hit the 4/3 and play Mukla and re-dagger. I think it's okay to take the 8. The conditions in which Warrior will kill you are way late in the game to where you're losing already because you're not killing them.
Right.
I think it is fine to Mukla hero power. They pretty much have to have either Whirlwind Execute or Brawl or something, and Brawl should still be okay for us because we get a card and something sticks.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
The face tanking was a little risky, but it was really awkward for us to give up 2 minions and power there, and I think it just looks a lot cleaner.
Yeah,
Just
well,
a lot better.
I feel like a lot of times when I'm playing against Warrior, I think of my health total as basically everything from 15 to 30 I can afford to burn, because they're eventually going to play Alex, anyway. Wow, is this for real? The Armor Smith after the Whirlwind?
Well, they had Banana it too, Potassium.
Oh, okay, alright, I see you.
So we're starting to realize that our hand is kind of running out of things to do, and this is where, just like last game, we're going to need the Coldlight versus control.
For sure. Do you feel like it almost feels obligatory here to play Eviscerate on this Armor Smith? Is that your thinking as well?
So the pros and cons here of using Deadly Poison SI is that we're developing very well, but the downside is we don't get to save Deadly Poison for our Assassin's Blade. But Assassin's Blade is a one-of, and that's a little bit too long game thinking for us being out of cards.
Right.
So we can either Deadly Poison SI, that spends 4 of our mana, and also develop a Leper Gnome, being that we just saw the Whirlwind.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little all-in, but we definitely need to start pushing. I kind of want to Deadly Poison it and then SI it.
I think this is a reasonable play. And
Figure we might as well pop a Leper Gnome in there as well.
Sure.
Buying ourselves as much time to draw Coldlight by pressuring, and we just saw removal, so...
Right, we've seen 1 Whirlwind, 1 Execute. Not that Execute is the only way to kill an SI, but, we've already seen something that could follow a Whirlwind up gracefully. And
what is up with these control decks doing damage to us today?
yeah, I know, right? Down to 19. Alright, so Harry J, another, kind of a punish, but also he's not drinking that.
Oh my goodness.
This isn't fair. Do our next deck spotlight on Control Warrior, I guess.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like we're really able to trade here. We've only got 3 cards left in hand.
We're going to have to go Argent Squire and then Eviscerate and Dagger. We have to Eviscerate Harrison because we're the ones with the low life total and we need to buy time to draw Coldlight. I like just Dagger here. I don't like extending the Arcane.
Mm-hmm. Go face.
Also, I'm going to use the bathroom real quick. Yes, go face. And I'm going to use the bathroom real quick and I'll be right back.
Cool. Take your time. Now the deck is all mine. I'll use my divination powers to draw this 1 and 18. We'll go 2 and 19 Coldlight Oracle next turn. Holy hell. Alright, so now that this is swung, Grom plus Task isn't deadly yet. We got 10, 11, 12. So we're 2 off lethal here. One of the considerations in this position is if we play Arcane Golem, we're giving our opponent 9 mana, which means if we do this full burn, we're getting them down to 2, but then they can Alex back up because they'll have 9 mana from this Arcane Golem. So I'm tempted not to play the Arcane Golem here. At the same time, I'm wondering, I'm not sure if we play Leroy here, we're not in any terrible danger. There's also the possibility of playing Leroy and pinging off either one or both of these whelps, making it more awkward for them to deal with.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah, cool. Got kind of an interesting choice here of whether to play Leroy or not this turn. Possibility to ping off the whelps, or 2 off lethal. What do you say? You want to let the guy fly?
I would probably... What's our life total at? I was thinking our Argent over, or Arcane over Leroy, I mean. The only problem is
It'll put them at 9, though.
Well, yeah, let's just chill then.
Alright.
Let's chill.
That's cool. Yeah, keep it
Still
in
die. We died a Grom Interfire. No, we don't. So yeah, we're starting to Interfire, Inner Rage. But we're still, we're pretty safe here.
Right, yeah, now that Gorehowl's already hit 1 minion.
Best thing they can do is like Rag, and they're taking 1 here, and if they play something on curve so big, they just die to our burn.
Right.
Without exactly 11, so they can't just play an 8-mana card.
And we've got a couple of outs left in the deck here, too. We've got Shadowsteps, we've got Abusives, we've got Cold Bloods left. We got an Eviscerate left in the deck as well.
Yeah.
Alright, so what's that? 10, 11.
So we can still play everything next turn. So yeah, unless we got like a Coldlight for a lethal out and it's not a Shadowstep. Nice.
Alright, I think
one dead control player.
Nice. Alright. Some maybe questionable choices made by them, but yeah, I like this.
One without Coldlight. One without extra cards, extra resources.
Yeah, I think we can be proud of that. That's pretty much exactly what this deck is supposed to do, right? Is it's supposed to use its very last card to kill you, and then basically be in a losing position, right?
It's kind of crazy if you look at it, that our opponent had a way to deal with the Whirlwind and the Execute on the Mukla. Like, that's above average, I would say.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the Warrior single target removal is specific scenarios, like they either have to have a bunch of armor, which he already played shield block.
Mm-hmm.
So he either has to have a bunch of armor or has to damage everything like he did and then attack it. And he drew both Whirlwinds, which is like one of the best cards in the matchup. So he drew 2 of the best cards in the matchup.
Right.
And he had the Execute also for the same turn that we had Mukla.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going first.
Yeah.
I told you. Okay, so we're definitely not keeping... I don't really like Deadly Poisons. We need a 1-drop.
You'd rather. I mean, there's a situation in which maybe we have, a chance at Flurry.
Flurry is what you're talking about.
Yeah, and maybe just I don't know. I mean, we take a lot of face damage if we count on Deadly, but do you
don't think we can just count on it, to be honest.
Can we keep?
I think we just have to. Do want to try and keeping the SI, and I'm using the word try because sometimes it'll work, sometimes we'll be too far behind. But I think we can hit a 1-drop if we just believe.
All right, Abusive Sergeant. It's good. It's good enough. It's a 1-drop. And Shadowstep actually not too bad here, right? Some possibilities at least with this, but Assassin's Blade can be a real brick.
Was there anything? I was trying to think if there was anything else to say about last game. I mean, we pretty much... It's just still crazy to me that he got the nuts, and even without draw, we beat him. It's just so much burn.
Yeah, yeah. And
got like the best removal you can ask for.
Even with the coin shield block. All right, this situation already it's a little bit difficult for us. I don't think we ever use Eviscerate. We always use our dagger. Question is, do we ping off?
A lot of interesting ideas here. So let's talk over the potential lines.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely want the 2-1 to die this turn. The most interesting line I could possibly think of, going face with our 2-1, shadow stepping it so that we have a 0-drop for the SI next turn. That's the most interesting line we can go for. Not really getting good value out of our shadow step. Anyway, I think we'd face tank the 2-1.
Mm-hmm.
Face with our 2-1 because they would have played Archer there if they had it. And I actually want to try the Shadow Step line. I just want to try it. I'm not sure about it. I just want to see if it works out because you don't have a very good turn next turn. We might be missing something, but I kind of like developing a 3-3 while doing it.
No, I think this is a really cool line. This is a use of Shadow Step that I hadn't anticipated. Now, obviously, we could use Shadow Step a little bit later on, like turn 4 with SI, but that might not be giving us quite as much value.
So we get a little, the reward play here is we have, so we have Deckhand into Abusive and to hit the 2-1. That's a pretty good line.
Mm-hmm.
We then lose our SI combo. There's Deckhand into Eviscerate and to hit the 2-1.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sad that we got Not necessarily punished. Like we had Deckhand into a Vis anyway, so we could have just would have had to top deck to draw an SI. But if we were to draw a 1-drop next turn, we had like 1-drop SI next turn.
Right.
So I'm trying to think if we want to just Vis. We're kind of we want to go like Deckhand Vis here and send the Deckhand face again.
Yeah, I like this play. Reminder to always attack with the deckhand before you play. I'm sure we've all made that mistake maybe once or twice.
Another thing here, though, is if we didn't play the Shadowstep earlier, we could have Shadowstepped this 2-1. Mortal Coil Runner.
Oh, okay.
Interesting. It's not bad. It's just not Giga common.
Okay, now Blade Flurry seems pretty good here. Yeah, you feel like clearing this board? I don't feel like there's any other choice, right?
Like, did they? I mean, yeah. I'm pretty down to just dagger the 1/1 and then Flurry.
My thought is that this card, which our opponent didn't mulligan, I would assume that it's Doomguard, so they may not even have something good to play next turn.
Or 4/4.
Yeah. Let's give it a shot. Let's clear this board.
Developing here isn't good for us.
Right.
The only other alternative play is to hold dagger, but that's not good because we don't have a Blade Flurry Deadly Poison guaranteed.
Right.
We can't really stall till Assassin's Blade because we take too much. This is insane.
Soulfire.
We're doing great.
13 HP. Let's see if we can survive. Alright. It seems like Assassin's Blade might be a little bit slow, or maybe it's a little scary to leave this Abusive up. What do you think?
This is really a tough decision here. Very crucial decision, too.
Well, we've seen one Soulfire. I'm curious what you think about playing Abusive, SI, and Cold Blood so that the Doomguard can't trade into us. If it's Doomguard. Is there anything else that can remove this 7/3 if we play it on the board like that? The other option is, we can dagger this thing down, but
a lot of people would just go face with the Doomguard from the zoo perspective. At least people on ladder.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of just want to go Abusive, SI it, then dagger the face. That way, you can just go Assassin's Blade into Cold Blood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a nice graceful play. I like this.
If he does happen to Doomguard and he does happen to trade, he can literally just Cold Blood the 2/1 and send it face if we want to. Yeah.
Deadly Poison. That's not too bad to see either. Okay, so how are we going to sequence this? I'm thinking about pinging off this with the last charge of our dagger here, running the 3/3 in and then going face. Does that seem reasonable?
Hit the 2/2 with our current dagger. Hit the 2/1 in. Play Assassin's Blade. And you should probably Cold Blood this.
Alright, let's go. We're going in for the kill. We flipped the switch here, right? As now we have 12 next turn total. All we need to do is draw just a small amount more. Maybe
current
the punish
draw, still Cold Light probably, because that'll give us the small burn we need, aside from like Leroy.
Yeah.
Also, the Defender lists in Zoo are harder for our Rogue. It's actually still one of the harder. I think it was still worth hitting for that much damage.
I think
Getting
so
the
too.
3 plus 4 here worth.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now we've got 4 heading face, so if we see a Doomguard, we're dead. But I feel like our only choice here is... Right.
Yeah, we have to combo this.
Just
it's not like we can save it for this. Yeah, everything face.
What do you think, hero power? We like to have
I've seen
fun
people
here.
do that.
That's why there are no aggro rogue bots.
Oh, see, and he can't really tap. He had to tap first if he wanted the Doomguard, and it wasn't lethal.
Oh.
Freaking Worgen, dude.
Worgen. Yeah,
oh my god.
Surprisingly, a situation in which Sap would have helped against Azu.
Again.
And the perfect juggle as well, the perfect 50-50 juggle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Dude, this is why I don't run Worgen. Like, it's just cursed.
yeah, yeah,
Worgen Curse Infiltrator.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely, well played. By it was a really close one though. You know, we put up a real fight, and honestly, losing to a unfortunate 50-50 on the um, knife juggle here was a little bit traumatizing. But
Shadowstep. Did the Shadowstep play work out? Like, it ended up not being perfect because of our top deck. We might have gotten 2 SIs, so we might have lost because of the Shadowstep. I mean, of course, to the bad top deck, but and not getting draw and everything. But
I think
wonder.
we'd have to probably look at what the odds were that we drew a 1-drop the next turn, which I don't think were fantastic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think the majority of our draws that would have actually been the correct play to play
Yeah.
that shadow step there. All right, we've been at it for 2 hours. I'm sure that we all have food to eat and breaks to take, but I just want to say again, I really appreciate you sharing your insights into this deck and helping us understand this aggro rogue. For all the viewers out there, we'll make sure that we have a list for this deck attached to the video as well. And as well, I'd like to shout out your Twitter and your Twitch streams. That's LaboreSangre. I'll type it in here in my card finder here. But LaboreSangre, you can find him.
Into my card.
Yeah.
Enchant my card, chat.
Yeah, let's see if it pulls up Leroy.
The results, not yet.
No, we'll get you
We
in
gotta
there in the
win
future.
worlds first.
Exactly. But yeah, the fantastic deck, Aggro Rogue, obviously that deck that's been around for a long time and I think has stood the test of time. And it's cool that you're bringing back this deck that honestly I feel like is maybe a little underrepresented amongst aggro decks on the ladder. So appreciate the work that you're doing to bring face decks that include multiple copies of Arcane Golem and Leroy into the fray here.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, had a lot of fun. Any last words that you'd like to share with your fans?
You don't feel like playing Miracle? Play this deck. You'll catch people off guard a lot of time. Just be wary of Zoo, and don't be afraid to. Most important thing in casual in any Hearthstone you play, don't feel down when you make a mistake. You just gotta focus on learning and having fun.
Yeah, you know, in chess we have this term win, draw, learn, and you know every loss that you have in a game is an opportunity to learn something. And I'd say we learned something right here, right? Is that in the tonight's meta or just as far as deck building decisions go, Worgen Infiltrator didn't work out for us as well as Sap would. So something that helps to convince us more. Obviously, 3 games of data isn't quite enough for us to really make a definitive decision there.
3 sad Worgen draws isn't enough.
Yeah, I know, right? Emotionally speaking, I'm ready to make the commitment for Sap instead of Worgen right now. But yeah, as always,
Yeah.
we win some, we lose some, and it's okay to learn from our losses as well. All right, so on behalf of me and the I'm Opposition and the Hearthstone crew that we have in the Discord, big shout out to all of our friends that helped make this happen. And once again, LaboreSangre, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Really appreciated having you on.
That's an honor. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Awesome. All right, we're going to call it there for the night. Good night, everybody. Have happy holidays. I hope you have a happy new year as well.
Everybody.